My name is Claire, 33 years old, and after sacrificing 7 years of my life to care for my father, he looked me dead in the eye and left his entire $1.2 million estate to my sister. The sister who had only shown up 4 weeks ago. I just smiled, handed over the power of attorney, and walked away. When my father read the invoice I left behind, he screamed my name. He had no idea I was about to legally seize everything he owned. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who used you until you had nothing left to give. The dining room of my father Richard's large suburban home felt suffocating. The crystal chandelier cast a warm glow over the prime rib and roasted asparagus I had spent 3 hours preparing. But the warmth stopped there. Richard tapped his silver fork against his wineglass. The sharp clinking sound silenced the entire room. He cleared his throat, adjusting his tailored collar, a man who still demanded absolute authority despite the wheelchair he sat in. "I have made a final decision regarding my estate," Richard announced. His voice was loud, carrying the arrogance of a man who believed his money made him invincible. He did not look at me. He looked directly at my older sister Sloane. "This house, all $1.2 million of it, along with my entire investment portfolio, will be transferred to Sloane and her husband Jamal." I kept my eyes on my plate. I sliced a perfect square of steak, the knife gliding smoothly through the meat. I did not flinch. I did not gasp. I chewed my food while my father continued his speech. "Sloane and Jamal are the future of this family legacy," Richard declared proudly. "They know how to build wealth. They know how to maintain our status in this community." Sloane leaned back in her chair, swirling her red wine. She wore a smug smile that practically stretched from ear to ear. "Do not worry, Claire," she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "We are not going to throw you out on the street. You can keep staying in the basement bedroom. As long as you keep changing his bedpans and cooking our meals, we will let you live here rent-free." Jamal chuckled deeply. He leaned forward, the gold of his heavy watch shining brightly against his dark skin. "Come on, Sloane, be generous," Jamal said, shaking his head. "Claire has worked hard playing the glorified amateur nurse all these years. It is not her fault she lacks the brains for real business. Some people are just born to serve." I took a sip of my sparkling water. 7 years. I had given up my mid-20s to bathe my father, feed him, and manage his daily medications after his massive stroke. I had moved into this house when he could not even form a complete sentence. I handled every physical therapy appointment. I managed every late-night emergency room visit. And Sloane. Sloane had lived across the country, too busy attending galas and posting vacation photos to even call on his birthday. She had miraculously flown into Seattle exactly 4 weeks ago, right after the lawyer accidentally leaked that he was updating his final will. 4 weeks of bringing him store-bought cupcakes had somehow erased 7 years of my blood sweat and absolute devotion. "You have to be realistic, Claire," my father added finally, looking in my direction. "I paid for her expensive business degree because she showed promise. You always lacked ambition. I need someone competent handling my assets, not someone who spends her days washing bedsheets and sorting pills. You should be grateful Sloane is willing to keep a roof over your head." Grateful. The word tasted like ash. They genuinely believed I was a helpless maid, entirely dependent on their mercy. They saw the faded scrubs I wore around the house. They saw the tired circles under my eyes. They did not see the laptop hidden in my basement room. They did not see the late-night conference calls I took while they slept. They had absolutely no clue who I really was. I placed my fork down on the porcelain plate. The sound was soft but deliberate. I picked up my napkin, dabbed the corners of my mouth, and folded it neatly beside my glass. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice. I reached down to the floor beside my chair and lifted my leather tote bag. I unzipped the main compartment and pulled out a thick, heavy legal folder. I slid it smoothly across the mahogany table. It stopped perfectly right in front of her plate. She stared at it, her smug smile faltering for just a fraction of a second. Jamal stopped laughing. My father narrowed his eyes. "What is this?" Sloane asked, eyeing the folder like it was a live grenade. "Just a little reading material for the future head of the family," I replied, my voice steady and completely void of emotion. "You might want to open it." The silence in the dining room became so heavy you could cut it with a steak knife. Sloane reached out with a manicured hand and flipped the cover. Inside lay the documents that would change everything. I watched her eyes scan the first page. She did not understand yet. She saw the official letterhead and the bold print. She had no idea that her perfect little world was about to collapse under the weight of her own greed. She had no idea that the sister she had bullied for decades was about to take back every single thing she owed me. The game was finally over now, and I was the one who just won. Sloane stared at the bold letters at the top of the first page. She blinked rapidly, her perfectly shaped eyebrows pulling together in deep confusion. "Power of attorney," she read aloud, her voice wavering between annoyance and disbelief. She looked up from the crisp papers, her eyes darting between me and Jamal. "What is this supposed to mean, Claire? Are you trying to make me sign some kind of waiver so you can steal Dad's savings?" I leaned back in my chair and rested my hands calmly in my lap. "It means exactly what it says, Sloane. I am officially resigning as Dad's primary caregiver and legal proxy. You want the family legacy. You get the massive liability that comes with it. As of exactly 12 o'clock tonight, the medical and financial power of attorney officially transfers completely to you." I reached into my tote bag one more time. I pulled out the heavy brass ring holding the keys to the front door, the garage, and the locked medical supply cabinet in the hallway. I dropped them right on top of the legal documents. The metal hit the mahogany table with a loud thud that made Sloane physically jump in her seat. Jamal let out a loud, mocking laugh, crossing his arms over his expensive designer suit. "You cannot just quit taking care of your own father," he scoffed, shaking his head. "Who do you think is going to change his bedsheets every single morning? Who is going to crush his pills and feed him his meals? You think my wife is going to ruin her nails doing the dirty work you have been doing for 7 years? You are bluffing. You have nowhere else to go. You do not even have a real job to support yourself in the real world." I ignored Jamal entirely. My eyes remained fixed squarely on my father. Richard's face had turned a deep, dangerous shade of purple. The veins in his neck bulged as he gripped the armrests of his specialized medical wheelchair. He hated losing control. He hated when people did not cower at his burning anger. And most of all, he hated that I was sitting there completely unfazed by the fact that he had just proudly disinherited me in front of his favorite child. "Sit down right now, Claire!" Richard barked, his voice echoing loudly off the high ceilings of the formal dining room. "You will not speak to your sister that way in my house. You will show her the respect she deserves. She is stepping up to manage my estate because she actually knows how to handle real money. You are throwing a childish tantrum because you finally realize your proper place in this family." I remained standing. My posture was perfectly straight. I felt absolutely no desire to argue with him anymore. I had spent 20 years begging for scraps of his approval, trying to prove my worth to a man who only valued superficial appearances. I was finally done playing his twisted game. "Respect is earned, Dad," I said, my voice dangerously soft but crystal clear. "I spent 7 years keeping you alive. I handled every single emergency hospital visit. I managed your exhausting physical therapy schedules. I stayed up with you for 3 days straight when you had your second severe stroke scare last winter." Sloane visited exactly twice in 7 years. The only thing she respects is the rising balance in your checking account. "Do not you dare act like a martyr!" Richard yelled, slamming his good hand onto the table, making the fine silverware rattle sharply against the expensive china. "You stayed here because you had no other options available. You stayed because you are exactly the same mediocre disappointment you were at 18. Do you think I forgot why I refused to pay for your college tuition? Do you remember what I told you that day in my office?" I remembered it perfectly. It was the exact same year he bought Sloane a brand new luxury sports car just for getting accepted into a mediocre party school. He had sat in his leather recliner, looked at my acceptance letter to a prestigious business program, and tossed it right into the trash can without a second thought. "I told you that you lacked ambition," Richard sneered, his eyes filled with cutting disdain. "I told you that investing in your education was a complete waste of my wealth. You never had the drive to be a massive success. You never had the killer instinct required for the corporate world. Sloane has it. Jamal has it. They know how to dominate a room and close a lucrative deal. You only know how to hide in the background like a servant. That is why I am giving everything to them. They will multiply my legacy. You would just drain it dry. You are lucky I even let you live in my basement these past 7 years. You owe me deeply for keeping a solid roof over your head." Sloane chimed in, immediately tossing her blonde hair over her shoulder with a highly self-satisfied smirk. "Dad is completely right, Claire. You should be thanking us right now. We are taking the massive financial burden off your weak shoulders. You can just focus on the physical labor. It is what you are good at anyway. Do not worry, I will give you a weekly cash allowance for groceries so you do not starve down there." I looked at the three of them. A father who despised me, a sister who used me, a brother-in-law who mocked me. For 7 painful years they thought they had me trapped in a cage of obligation. They believed my tired eyes meant I was utterly defeated. I slowly reached into my winter coat and pulled out a sealed white envelope. "Read this when I leave," I said. "Have a great night." The front door clicked firmly shut. The heavy oak door latch clicked firmly into place, leaving a ringing, uncomfortable silence inside the formal dining room tonight. Sloane let out a loud, theatrical sigh and dramatically rolled her blue eyes at the empty, quiet wooden archway entrance. Jamal snorted, reaching for his crystal wine glass with a careless, arrogant flick of his finely manicured right-hand wrist. His heavy gold watch caught the bright glare of the massive crystal chandelier hanging elegantly directly above their empty heads. He took a large gulp of the expensive red wine before pointing a finger at the crisp white paper envelope. It sat squarely on Richard's plate, looking completely innocent, but carrying the ultimate destruction of their newly inherited financial world. "What do you think she left you?" Jamal asked, laughing a cruel, mocking smirk, playing on his perfectly moisturized lips. "A grocery list or maybe a handwritten plea for an allowance, so she can buy more of those terrible scrub. Or maybe she is finally billing us for her elite, highly specialized daily bedpan changing services in the dark basement." Sloane laughed, a sharp grating sound that bounced harshly off the dark mahogany walls of the expensive family dining room. "Just throw it away, Dad," she said, waving her hand dismissively as she reached for her own expensive wine glass. She is just trying to be dramatic because she finally realized her completely free ride in the basement officially ended. "We have real serious business to discuss tonight moving forward. We need to talk about liquidating the portfolio and transferring the property deeds immediately so Jamal can invest the capital." Richard did not laugh at all. His pride was still severely stung by my sheer defiance and absolute calm demeanor. I had not cowered whatsoever. I had not cried once. He hated that more than absolutely anything else in the entire world, and he wanted to punish me for it. He snatched the envelope off his plate with his good hand, his fingers slightly trembling from his lingering, fiery rage. "I will show her dramatic," he muttered angrily, tearing the silver wax seal open with sudden, highly aggressive physical force. "Let us see exactly what kind of pathetic, desperate excuse she has written this time to beg for my mercy." He yanked the thick, folded paper from inside the envelope and aggressively snapped it open with a loud, sharp pop. He adjusted his reading glasses, fully preparing to verbally mock whatever sentimental, pathetic nonsense he assumed I had carefully penned. His eyes darted across the top of the crisp page. Then they stopped completely dead, freezing in absolute total shock. The deep, angry purple flush that had heavily colored his aged face moments ago vanished in a singular, terrifying instant. It was instantly replaced by a sickly, chalky white pallor. His mouth hung slightly open, revealing his bottom row teeth. The thick paper in his hand began to shake uncontrollably. He blinked rapidly, moving the heavy document much closer to his face, as if his aging eyes were deceiving him. He read the top lines again, and then read again. His breathing suddenly turned incredibly shallow and incredibly rapid now. A wet, wheezing sound caught deeply in his tight throat. "Dad," Sloane asked, her annoying smirk finally dropping away completely. "Dad, what is it? What did she actually say inside? Are you having another medical spell right now? Speak up." Jamal leaned forward suddenly, tense, eyeing the expensive medical equipment. The machine was whirring quietly in the corner of the room, while Richard could not speak a single word aloud. He just stared at the heavy cardstock in his hand. It was not a handwritten plea, nor a grocery list. It was a formal, itemized, legally binding corporate service invoice. At the very top, stamped in bold, elegant, unmistakable lettering, was the prestigious corporate logo for Apex Healthcare Concierge Management. Below that professional crest was a single, terrifying, bold name. It made his stomach violently drop to the absolute floor. Chief Executive Officer was printed clearly above Claire Wilson's signature. Sloane impatiently snatched the paper directly out of his hand. Her eyes scanned the document and the healthy color drained. "What is Apex Healthcare?" she demanded, her voice rising frantically. "Why is her name on this, Jamal? This makes no sense. Why is her name listed at the very top? This has to be some kind of elaborate sick joke." Jamal stood up quickly, rounding the large table to read. His jaw visibly tightened as he looked at the columns. The detailed invoice showed exactly what Medicare and his private insurance had absolutely refused to cover over the past years. Specialized 24-hour critical care monitoring was listed first. The state-of-the-art $15,000 medical bed. The high-capacity dual oxygen concentrator that kept him alive. The rotating staff of premium private night shift registered nurses. My father had always naturally assumed his standard insurance was taking complete care of his highly premium lifestyle and needs. He had always proudly bragged about his excellent medical coverage. He never bothered to actually look at the massive bills. He never knew his insurance had completely capped out earlier. I subsidized his incredibly comfortable existence out of my pocket. Sloane read the staggering numbers aloud while her voice cracked. Oxygen equipment rental $0 and bed lease $0. Total accumulated value waived $480,000. Jamal violently grabbed the paper to read the final paragraph. Notice of immediate medical equipment repossession is fully effective tonight. Since the legal power of attorney has transferred to Sloane, Apex Healthcare Concierge is immediately terminating its pro bono sponsorship. All company-owned medical assets will be removed by midnight. It is your sole legal responsibility to provide medical replacements. Good luck. Sloane signed the letter at the very bottom. Richard clutched his chest while pure terror filled his eyes. "Claire, get back here right now!" he screamed in panic. Richard's screams echoed, but the door had shut, severing my ties to that house forever. I was driving away, city lights reflecting in my rearview mirror. Back inside, chaos erupted. Sloane frantically dialed my number. It went straight to voicemail. Jamal paced, muttering about legal technicalities he ignored. Richard sat paralyzed in his wheelchair, eyes locked on the invoice. The clock ticked closer to midnight. At 11:30, the street was bathed in the headlights of two massive transport trucks. They pulled into the driveway, reverse alarms cutting through the silent neighborhood. Bold lettering on the side read, "Apex Healthcare Concierge." Before Sloane could process what was happening, the doorbell rang with rapid chimes. Jamal marched to the door, tearing it open to find four men in matching uniforms holding dollies and toolboxes. "What do you think you are doing?" Jamal demanded, attempting to block the doorway. "You are trespassing on private property. I will have you all arrested." The foreman did not blink. He held up a clipboard displaying the repossession order. "We are here to collect company assets, sir. Apex Healthcare property. Move aside or we will call the police. We have legal authorization to reclaim our equipment immediately." Sloane rushed into the foyer, her face pale. "You cannot do this. My father is a sick man. You cannot take his bed away in the middle of the night. This is illegal. I am his power of attorney. I demand you stop right now." The foreman stepped past Jamal, his crew following behind. They marched directly toward Richard's master bedroom. The foreman paused and handed Sloan a business card. "If you have complaints regarding the repossession of our property, you can call our CEO. Have a good night." Sloan stared at the card. It bore the same terrifying name as the invoice, Claire Wilson. Inside the bedroom, the workers moved with ruthless efficiency. They unplugged the dual oxygen concentrator, the machine that helped Richard breathe every night. The rhythmic humming stopped, leaving an eerie, suffocating silence. Next, they dismantled the $15,000 medical bed. They hoisted the mattress onto the dollies, unscrewed the frame, and wheeled the pieces out the front door. Within 20 minutes, the sanctuary I had built for my father was stripped bare. Sloan and Jamal stood in the corner screaming empty threats about lawsuits. The workers ignored them, loading the trucks and driving away into the darkness. Richard lay flat on a stiff guest mattress Jamal had hastily dragged in. His chest heaved painfully. Without the elevation and concentrated oxygen flow, his breathing was shallow and labored. Panic set in. His face grew flush, sweat beading on his forehead. He demanded his phone. With shaking fingers, he dialed my number. I was sitting on the velvet sofa of my downtown penthouse. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Seattle skyline. I held a crystal glass of red wine, bought to celebrate my freedom. My phone buzzed on the glass coffee table. I saw his name on the screen. I took a slow sip of wine, savoring the flavor, before calmly answering the call. "Claire." Richard gasped, his voice a pathetic wheezing rasp. "You have to stop this. You have to bring the machines back right now. I cannot breathe properly on this cheap mattress. I am your father. You owe me. You cannot treat your own flesh and blood like this." I listened to his desperate gaslighting, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, hard satisfaction. The little girl who used to crave his approval was completely dead. "I do not owe you a single thing, Dad," I responded, my voice smooth and devoid of emotion. "I paid my debt with 7 years of my life. Sloan is your legal power of attorney now. Your comfort is entirely her responsibility. A new oxygen concentrator costs $15,000. I am sure Sloan can handle it. Just have Jamal swipe his black card. Good luck with the new management." I ended the call, silencing the device and tossing it onto the sofa. Back in the sterile, unequipped bedroom, Richard dropped the phone. He looked up at Sloan, his eyes wide with genuine fear. "Buy the machine," he wheezed, clutching his chest. "Buy it right now. I do not care what it costs. Just get it delivered overnight. I need the oxygen." Sloan panicked. Her hands shook as she pulled out her laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard. She navigated to a medical supply website, her heart pounding against her ribs. She found the dual oxygen concentrator they needed. The price tag was staggering $18,000 with expedited overnight delivery. She added it to the cart and turned to her husband. "Jamal, give me your card," Sloan demanded, her voice shrill with anxiety. "Dad needs the machine immediately. Give me the black card so I can process this payment." Jamal hesitated. His arrogant smirk was completely gone. He patted his jacket pockets, looking suddenly very nervous. "I left it in the car," he muttered, taking a step backward toward the bedroom door. "We do not have time for this," Sloan screamed. She lunged forward, plunging her hand directly into his breast pocket and pulling out his sleek leather wallet. She snatched the heavy metal card, ignoring his protests. She quickly typed the numbers into the checkout page. She hit the submit order button. A loading wheel spun on the screen. Sloan waited, holding her breath. The screen flashed bright red. Transaction declined. Insufficient funds. Sloan froze. She blinked, retyping the numbers perfectly. She hit submit again. Declined. She looked at the error message, then slowly turned her head to look at Jamal. The color had drained completely from his face. He was sweating profusely, his eyes darting toward the exit. In that terrifying silent moment, Sloan realized the horrifying truth. The designer suits, the heavy gold watches, the big talk about investments. It was all a complete lie. Her husband had no money at all. 48 hours later, the reality of their new kingdom crushed Sloane and Jamal. The master suite smelled of spilled medication and unwashed bedding. Sloane stood in the room, clutching a soiled bedpan with trembling hands. Her silk blouse was stained with dark fluids. Her blonde hair hung in greasy strands around her exhausted face. She stared blankly at Richard, who lay groaning on the cheap replacement mattress they secured on a payment plan. Without the medical bed moving, him required physical labor. Without the concentrator, his breathing was a terrifying rattle echoing through the house. Jamal leaned against the doorframe looking wretched. His suit jacket was replaced by a wrinkled sweatshirt. He pinched his nose to block the foul stench. "You need to roll him over so I can strip the fitted sheet," Jamal muttered, keeping his distance. Sloane slammed the bedpan down, splashing foul water onto the hardwood floor. "Do not tell me what to do, you fraud!" she screamed, her voice cracking. "You lied to me for 3 years, Jamal. A fake portfolio, a rented sports car, and maxed credit cards. We cannot afford to hire a home nurse. You promised me a fortune, but we inherited a financial black hole." Jamal stepped into the room, grabbing her by the shoulders. "Keep your voice down," he hissed, glancing at Richard, who was weakly coughing. "I took calculated business risks, Sloane. The market shifted. None of that matters right now because Claire set us up. She planned this disaster to ruin us financially and legally. She knew exactly how much this specialized care cost, and she dumped it on you deliberately." Sloane pulled away from his grip, wrapping her arms. "She legally transferred the power of attorney Jamal. She warned us about the liability. We signed the papers. We are completely responsible for him now, and we have absolutely zero money to keep him comfortable or alive." Jamal shook his head, a calculating gleam returning to his eyes. "No, Sloane, you are panicking like a victim. Claire cannot just abandon a severely disabled man in the middle of the night. There are strict laws against that kind of malicious negligence. She was his primary caregiver for 7 years. She abandoned a vulnerable senior citizen without proper medical transition. That is highly illegal." Sloane blinked, wiping a streak of sweat from her forehead. "What are you saying, Jamal?" "I am saying we do not need to pay for a nurse." Jamal sneered, a wicked smile spreading across his face. "We need to hire a lawyer. We are going to hit your precious sister with a massive lawsuit for elder abandonment and gross medical negligence. We will drag her corporate reputation through the absolute mud until she begs to take the power of attorney back. She has a highly profitable company to protect now. She will settle out of court and pay for everything just to keep this quiet." Within 2 hours, Jamal had made the call. He bypassed the prestigious law firms downtown, knowing they required heavy retainers he could not afford. Instead, he reached out to Mitchell Vance, a notoriously aggressive personal injury attorney, known for taking desperate cases on contingency. Mitchell was a shark in a cheap suit who thrived on public intimidation and nasty family disputes. He arrived at the house smelling of cheap cologne and black coffee, eager to exploit a wealthy healthcare chief executive officer. Mitchell paced the foul-smelling bedroom, taking excessive photographs of Richard lying in misery. "This is a goldmine," he declared enthusiastically, putting his smartphone back into his pocket. "Gross negligence, malicious endangerment, and intentional infliction of severe emotional distress. A jury will absolutely hate a wealthy corporate executive who abandons her crippled father to suffer on a cheap mattress. We are going to draft a demand letter so terrifying she will hand over her entire corporate checking account to make us go away." Sloane watched him eagerly, desperately clinging to this new lifeline. "Just make her take him back, Mitchell. Force her to reinstate the medical equipment and the nurses. I cannot do this for another single day." Mitchell slammed the threatening legal demand onto my glass desk with a loud thud. The sleazy attorney smirked, adjusting his cheap tie as if he had just delivered a fatal blow. Jamal stood beside him, crossing his arms with an expression of pure, arrogant triumph. He really believed he had backed me into a corner. Sloane stood slightly behind them, her face pale and her clothes reeking of the unwashed filth she had been dealing with for 48 hours. They honestly thought they could march into my corporate headquarters and force me back into the basement. I did not even flinch. I picked up the document and glanced at the ridiculous accusations of elder abandonment. I sighed softly and slid the paper directly into the motorized shredder sitting on my desk. The machine hummed quietly as it devoured their empty threats, reducing them to worthless ribbons of confetti. "Are you completely out of your mind?" Jamal shouted, stepping forward and slamming his hands flat against my desk. "You cannot ignore a legal summons, Claire. You are going to prison. You left a disabled senior citizen without life-saving medical equipment. That is criminal abandonment. We are going to destroy your precious company and lock you away unless you get back to that house right now." I looked at my platinum wristwatch, perfectly calm. "You are operating under a fundamental misunderstanding of the law." "Jamal," I replied, my voice completely smooth and devoid of any emotion. Before Jamal could scream another threat, the heavy doors of my office swung open. Marcus Thorne, my lead corporate counsel, strode into the room. He wore a bespoke suit and carried a slim black leather briefcase. Marcus was a legal apex predator, and his mere presence caused Mitchell to shrink backward. "My client is absolutely correct," Marcus announced, coming to stand firmly beside my desk. He did not look at Jamal or Sloane, his sharp, predatory gaze locked entirely onto Mitchell. "As an attorney, you should be deeply embarrassed to have drafted such a legally illiterate document. You have fundamentally misunderstood the concept of liability." "What are you talking about?" Mitchell stammered, taking another step back. She was his primary caregiver. She abandoned a vulnerable adult in the middle of the night. That is a clear violation of state welfare codes. Marcus laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Miss Wilson formally transferred the medical and financial power of attorney to her sister 2 days ago," Marcus explained, opening his briefcase with precise, measured movements. "We filed the transfer with the state registry the exact moment Sloane accepted the physical documents and keys to the property." Marcus pulled a crisp, legal document from his briefcase and held it up. "By accepting the power of attorney, Sloane legally assumed total and exclusive responsibility for her father's physical welfare. The absolute second her pen left that paper, my client was legally absolved of all caregiving duties." Sloane shook her head rapidly, her greasy blonde hair falling into her exhausted eyes. "But she took the machines," she cried out, her voice cracking with desperation. "She took his bed and his oxygen. He is suffering. She repossessed corporate assets from an unauthorized user." Marcus corrected, his tone turning sharp. "Assets you explicitly refuse to replace because your bank accounts are overdrawn. If Richard is lying in his own filth and gasping for air on an unequipped mattress that is not on my client, that is gross negligence on your part. If you report elder abandonment to the police, the only person leaving in handcuffs is you, Sloane. You are the sole liable party. Any suffering happening in that house right now is legally your fault." Sloane's mouth opened and closed as color drained from her face. She looked like a hollow, shattered shell. Jamal realized their criminal threat was dead in the water. He frantically pivoted, trying to salvage his scheme. "Fine," Jamal snarled, his eyes flashing with desperate anger. "We will not press criminal charges, but we are suing you for emotional distress, and we are liquidating the estate today. We will sell the house, put the old man in a cheap state-funded facility, and take the remaining capital for ourselves. You will not see a single dime of his money, Claire. We won." I stood up slowly, buttoning my blazer. I walked around my glass desk, stepping directly toward them. I unleashed the secret weapon I had been carefully preparing for 7 years. I dropped the atomic bomb. "You are not selling anything, Jamal," I stated, my voice ringing with authority. Marcus handed Mitchell a thick red folder. "This is a formal caregiver's lien," Marcus explained, watching the sleazy lawyer sweat. Miss Wilson was not acting as a familial volunteer. She was acting as the chief executive officer of Apex Healthcare Concierge. For 7 years, she meticulously invoiced her services at the standard market rate. $20,000 a month for 24-hour specialized high-acuity concierge medical care. Jamal staggered backward, hitting the leather sofa. "You cannot retroactively charge us for that!" He breathed, his eyes wide with horror. "I did not bill you retroactively, Jamal," I replied, a genuine smile finally touching my lips. "I billed the estate on the first of every single month for 7 years." Richard ignored the invoices, but the debt compounded legally. The total accumulated debt against Richard's estate is exactly $1.68 million. Sloane clutched her chest, gasping for air as if she were the one suffocating. But the house is only worth $1.2 million, she sobbed, her entire body trembling violently. I smiled at my sister, savoring the pure, unadulterated victory. Under federal and state law, medical debts must be settled completely before any inheritance is paid out, I explained smoothly. Dad's $1.2 million house. It belongs to my company now. You inherited a negative balance. Mitchell stood completely frozen in the center of the immaculate corporate office. His eyes darted frantically across the crisp, thick pages of the red folder Marcus had just handed him. The arrogant, sleazy swagger he carried into the room evaporated instantly. It was replaced by the sickening, pale complexion of a man who realized he had just walked blindly into a meticulously laid legal trap. The silence in the massive room was deafening, broken only by the sharp rustle of the thick paper as Mitchell flipped frantically to the final signature pages. Sloane watched him closely, her breath catching sharply in her tight throat. She waited for her aggressive attorney to shout an objection to find a glaring loophole to tear Claire and her ridiculous claims apart. Instead, Mitchell slowly lowered the heavy folder and swallowed hard. A bead of nervous sweat rolled down his temple. These contracts are completely ironclad, Mitchell muttered, his voice entirely devoid of its former booming confidence. He looked directly at Jamal and Sloane, his eyes wide with professional terror. Every single document in here is fully notarized, legally filed, and perfectly executed. There is a meticulously detailed ledger of services rendered, and it has been acknowledged and signed by your father annually for the past 7 years. Jamal violently snatched the heavy folder directly from the lawyer's trembling hands. His eyes scanned the thick black ink of Richard's unmistakable signature at the bottom of the page. How is this even possible? Jamal demanded, his voice cracking with rising panic. How did you trick him into signing his entire estate over to you? I never tricked him into anything, Jamal, I replied smoothly, leaning casually against the edge of my custom glass desk. I presented him with standard corporate vendor service contracts on the 1st of January every single year. But Dad was so utterly convinced that I was just a desperate, pathetic failure playing nurse that he never even bothered to read the fine print. He literally called my legally binding invoices medical mumbo-jumbo. He signed them without a second glance because his massive ego genuinely believed my specialized services were completely worthless. He severely underestimated me, just like the two of you did when you barged into my headquarters today, and that blinding arrogance just cost him absolutely everything he owned. The devastating reality crashed over Jamal like a physical blow. The heavy, suffocating weight of the terrifying numbers finally registered in his calculating brain. He stared blankly at the polished marble floor, doing the brutal math. The house was appraised at $1.2 million. The legally binding lien was for $1.68 million. He dropped the red folder onto the floor, allowing the papers to spill across the pristine marble. There is absolutely no money, Jamal whispered, his eyes widening in pure, unadulterated horror. He turned his head slowly toward his wife, his expression twisting rapidly from shock into a dark mask of pure rage. You lied to me. Sloane physically shrank back, her hands raised defensively in front of her chest. I did not know, Jamal, she pleaded, her voice shrill and trembling with sudden fear. I thought we were getting everything today. He promised me the entire estate. We can fight this in court. We can appeal the lien. Jamal let out a harsh barking laugh that echoed violently off the pristine glass walls of the executive office. Appeal with what money, Sloane, he screamed, stepping toward her aggressively. My credit cards are completely maxed out. My sports car is leased. I am drowning in massive debt because I spent the last 3 years keeping up appearances waiting for your rich father to finally die so we could cash out. You promised me a multi-million-dollar payday. You brought me a negative balance and a dying man. Marcus calmly stepped forward, motioning firmly toward the heavy glass doors. I highly suggest you take your domestic dispute outside, Marcus stated with icy professionalism. You are trespassing on corporate property, and the chief executive officer has a highly profitable company to run. If you fail to vacate the premises immediately, my security team will escort you out, followed closely by the local police. Mitchell was the absolute first to flee, scrambling toward the exit, without uttering another single word, eager to escape a disastrous case that promised zero financial payout. Jamal grabbed Sloane roughly by the arm, dragging her forcefully toward the private elevators. Sloane cast one final desperate look over her shoulder at me. Her blue eyes were wide with pure panic, silently begging for a lifeline from the sister she had spent her entire life stepping on. I simply offered her a polite corporate smile and turned my attention back to my computer screen. The heavy glass doors slid shut, sealing them out of my successful world forever. Down in the subterranean parking garage, the suffocating tension finally exploded into a spectacular public meltdown. Sloane chased Jamal toward the sleek, black leased sports car, her designer heels echoing sharply against the cold concrete. Jamal! Wait, we have to go back to the house! Sloane cried out, grabbing his jacket sleeve desperately. We have to figure out a medical plan for Dad. We cannot just leave him there alone on that cheap mattress. Jamal roughly yanked his arm away, his face twisted in absolute disgust. We are not doing anything, Sloane, he snarled, marching to the rear of the vehicle. He hit a button on his key fob and the trunk popped open. Inside, sitting perfectly packed and ready, was a large designer suitcase. Sloane stared at the heavy luggage, her breath hitching painfully in her chest. You packed a bag, she whispered, the ultimate brutal betrayal finally dawning on her. You were planning to leave me this whole time. Jamal grabbed the handle of his heavy suitcase and pulled it out, throwing it carelessly into the back seat of the car. I was planning to leave the absolute second the money dried up, he admitted with brutal, devastating honesty. You are absolutely nothing without your father's wealth, Sloane. You are just a spoiled, useless burden. I am not spending the rest of my life wiping a sick old man and drowning in your family debt. He reached deep into his pocket, pulled out the heavy brass keys to Richard's house, and violently hurled them directly at her chest. The keys hit her hard and clattered loudly onto the cold concrete floor. Good luck with those medical bills, Jamal sneered. He slid into the driver's seat, revved the loud engine of his leased car, and sped out of the parking garage, leaving Sloane completely abandoned and stranded in the dim, echoing silence. Sloane stood completely alone in the echoing concrete parking garage, clutching the cold brass keys. She was forced to order a rideshare using the last sliver of battery on her phone. During the humiliating 40-minute ride back to the suburbs, sitting in the back of a cheap sedan, her phone vibrated with a sudden barrage of automated bank alerts. She opened her financial app and her blood ran entirely cold. The joint checking account she shared with Jamal displayed a balance of $0.00. He had executed a massive wire transfer the exact minute he sped out of the corporate building. Panic accelerating, Sloane frantically checked her personal credit cards. Every single line of credit was completely maxed out. Jamal had taken emergency cash advances on her signature cards, withdrawing tens of thousands of dollars and leaving her as the sole liable party. He had financially gutted her and vanished without a single trace. Sloane staggered up the driveway to Richard's house. The sprawling suburban property had once been a symbol of her guaranteed future wealth. Now it felt like a massive, suffocating prison. She unlocked the heavy front door and was instantly hit by the overwhelming stench of sickness and neglect. Without Claire's team of professional cleaners and high-grade medical sanitation systems, the house had deteriorated in less than 48 hours. The pristine environment Claire had maintained was entirely gone, replaced by the harsh reality of untreated illness. From the ground floor, master suite, Richard's voice echoed through the silent house. His tone was not frail or frightened, it was furious. Sloane, he bellowed, his voice raspy, but dripping with intense entitlement. Where have you been? I need my 3 o'clock medication, and my pillows are damp. Sloane walked into the bedroom, and the reality of her situation hit her with crushing force. The premium hydraulic medical bed was gone. The quiet hum of the commercial-grade oxygen concentrator was absent. The vital sign monitors that used to sit on the nightstand had vanished. Richard lay flat on a standard guest mattress, propped up awkwardly by regular decorative pillows, his face pale and his breathing labored. "Fix this mattress," Richard demanded, glaring at her wrinkled clothes. "Call Claire and tell her to bring my equipment back immediately. My back is in absolute agony." Sloane gripped the doorframe, her hands shaking violently. "Claire is not coming back, Dad," she said, her voice completely hollow. "She took everything. We have absolutely no money to replace it. Jamal took the last of my cash and left me." Richard sneered, his face twisting in absolute disgust. He fiercely refused to comprehend the reality of his total financial ruin. "You let your husband steal from you," he barked, his voice laced with venom. "You are completely incompetent, Sloane. Claire never let this house fall into this kind of pathetic disarray. Claire had my meals prepared on a strict schedule. Claire knew exactly how to adjust my monitors and keep me comfortable." The heavy irony of his words struck Sloane like a physical blow. For 7 long years, she and Richard had openly mocked Claire. They had called her a glorified babysitter and a pathetic failure for building a healthcare business instead of a traditional corporate empire. Now Richard was openly praising Claire's flawless efficiency while tearing Sloane apart for lacking those exact same skills. Sloane stepped forward, attempting to help Richard sit up so she could adjust his damp sheets. She reached under his shoulders and pulled, but he was dead weight. As she tried to physically lift him, her grip slipped. Richard yelled in pain, slapping her hands away with surprising force. "You are entirely useless," he spat, glaring at her with the same condescending disdain he used to reserve exclusively for Claire. "You cannot even manage a simple bedsheet. Get out of my room and find someone who actually knows what they are doing." Sloane stumbled backward out of the bedroom and collapsed against the hallway wall. She slid down to the hardwood floor, burying her face in her shaking hands. A brutal, heavy realization crushed her chest, making it difficult to breathe. She lacked the basic competence, the physical strength, and the logistical intelligence to do even 10% of what Claire had effortlessly managed for 7 years. Claire had orchestrated a massive round-the-clock medical operation, shielded Richard from his own declining reality, and built a highly lucrative multi-million-dollar empire simultaneously. Sloane could not even successfully adjust a pillow or manage a single bank account. As Sloane sat sobbing on the floor, the sharp, heavy sound of the front doorbell echoed through the house. It was not a polite knock. It was the firm, authoritative pounding of official business. She dragged herself up from the floor, wiping her face, and walked numbly to the entryway. Through the glass sidelight, she saw a man in a dark suit holding a thick stack of papers. She opened the door just a few inches. The man thrust a heavy legal packet directly into her hands. "Sloane Wilson," the man stated flatly, "you are hereby served." Sloane stared at the bold black letters printed across the top of the thick document. It was a formal notice of intent to foreclose. Attached directly beneath the bank notice was a secondary legal filing from Apex Healthcare Concierge. Claire's powerful corporate legal team had officially initiated the aggressive asset seizure process to collect the $1.68 million medical debt. The estate was being liquidated. The countdown had officially begun, and Sloane had absolutely nowhere left to run. The soft chime of my private office line broke the perfect silence of my corporate suite. I did not immediately look up from the financial projections illuminated across my dual monitors. The chime repeated, followed by the gentle hum of the automated speakerphone engaging. The caller ID glowed brightly on the screen, displaying the main landline number of the suburban estate I had just legally decimated. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, steepling my fingers together, and watched the call seamlessly route to my voicemail system. A moment later, the digital transcription program activated, and Richard's ragged, wheezing voice echoed through the high-fidelity speakers. "Claire, pick up the phone. I know you are sitting there listening to this." His voice sounded remarkably frail, but laced with a frantic, breathless panic. I could hear the desperate, ragged intake of air between his words, a clear indicator that Sloane had absolutely no idea how to properly calibrate the backup oxygen tank. "Claire, you have to come back here immediately." Richard coughed violently, a harsh, wet sound that vibrated through the speakers. Sloane is completely useless. She dropped my medication tray on the floor and ran into the hallway crying like a toddler. Jamal took her money and abandoned her, and now some man in a cheap suit just handed her a stack of foreclosure documents. You cannot do this to us. You cannot take my home. You have to call off your attack dogs right now. I picked up my porcelain coffee cup and took a slow, measured sip. The expensive dark roast tasted absolutely incredible. Please, Claire. Richard pleaded, his tone shifting into a pathetic whining whimper. I am your father. I am a sick old man. I am in terrible pain, and this mattress is destroying my spine. You have made your point. You proved you have money and power. Now come home and fix this mess before the bank throws me out onto the street. I need my equipment. I need my nurses. I need you. The silence stretched on the recording for several seconds, filled only by his labored breathing. When I did not pick up the line to rescue him, his fragile facade of a victim completely shattered. The deeply ingrained narcissism, the ugly entitlement that had defined his entire existence clawed its way back to the surface. You ungrateful, vicious little snake! Richard snarled, his voice suddenly vibrating with raw, venomous rage. This is what I get for putting a roof over your head. You are trying to destroy me over ancient history. I know exactly what this is about. You are still punishing me for your college graduation. You have harbored a pathetic childish grudge for over a decade because you were always insanely jealous of your sister. I set my coffee cup down silently. I kept my eyes fixed on the live financial dashboard tracking the explosive quarterly growth of Apex Healthcare Concierge. You think you are so smart? Richard ranted, his voice growing louder and more frantic. You think you are justified in stealing my estate because I bought Sloane that $70,000 sports car for her graduation while you got nothing. She was beautiful, Claire. She had social connections to maintain. She needed a premium luxury vehicle to attract a high-net-worth husband and secure her future in elite circles. You did not need a sports car. You were always just stubborn and difficult. He paused to cough again, hacking aggressively into the receiver. Yes, I forced you to pay your own way, Richard shouted defensively, openly admitting his financial abuse on a recorded line. Yes, I made you co-sign those predatory student loans with the criminal interest rates. But look at you now. I did you a massive favor. I knew you were strong enough to handle it. You had grit. Sloane was incredibly fragile and needed constant protection. You were built like a draft horse. You were designed to carry the heavy burdens. I gave you the gift of struggle so you could build this precious company you are using to terrorize me. You owe me your success. The utter delusion of his words was staggering. He was actually attempting to take credit for the multi-million-dollar empire I had built with my own bare hands. He genuinely believed that financially crippling me and forcing me into a decade of high-interest debt was an act of profound parental guidance rather than a deliberate act of sabotage. Claire, please. His voice cracked, the rage suddenly collapsing back into pure terror as the reality of his situation set in again. The bank is giving us 30 days. Your lawyers are freezing the remaining accounts. Sloane cannot even afford to order groceries. I am begging you. Do not let me die in a state-funded facility. Pick up the phone, call Marcus Thorne and stop this. I am your father. The voicemail automatically disconnected, terminating the call with a sharp digital click. I sat perfectly still in my immaculate office, surrounded by original artwork and panoramic views of the Seattle skyline. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I did not feel a shred of sympathy or lingering anger. I felt a profound, beautiful, clinical indifference. The man pleading on the other end of that phone was a complete stranger to me. He was simply a severely delinquent account, a defaulted debtor, facing the standard consequences of extreme financial negligence. I turned my attention back to my computer screens. The numbers glowing on the digital dashboard were absolutely astronomical. My company had just finalized the aggressive acquisition of 3 regional healthcare competitors. Our profit margins had soared by 200% in the last fiscal quarter alone. The $1.68 million lien I had placed on Richard's estate was practically a rounding error in my corporate ledger. It was a drop in the bucket compared to the massive wealth I generated daily. But it was never about needing the money. It was about extracting the exact cost of their arrogance. I reached out and placed my finger on the sleek digital console resting on my desk. I pulled up the call log interface, highlighting the primary residence number that had tormented me for so many years. With one smooth, effortless motion, I tapped the screen. Delete. The voicemail vanished into the digital void, erased from existence. I tapped the screen a second time, adding the number to my global corporate block list. The heavy silence in my office returned completely undisturbed by the ghosts of my past. Sloane stood in the center of the suffocating master bedroom, staring at the dark mahogany safe tucked inside the expansive walk-in closet. Richard was currently asleep, his ragged breathing rattling harshly in his chest. Without Claire's specialized respiratory equipment, he sounded like a drowning man. Sloane ignored him entirely. Her mind was frantically calculating pure survival. Jamal had completely drained their joint bank accounts and deliberately shattered her credit score. The bank foreclosure notice sat heavily on the kitchen counter. She needed hard, untraceable cash, and she needed it by the end of the day. She knew the combination to the heavy safe. Richard had proudly showed it to her on her 21st birthday, boasting arrogantly about the tangible wealth he had accumulated. Sloane spun the cold metal dial. The thick steel door clicked open, revealing a custom velvet-lined interior. Inside sat Richard's prized antique watch collection and stacks of authentication certificates for the original oil paintings hanging in the grand hallway. Sloane pulled out the heavy wooden display box. She opened the lid and stared at the gleaming timepieces. A vintage Patek Philippe, a pristine Rolex Daytona, an Audemars Piguet. They were immaculate symbols of the elite status she was desperately clinging to. She grabbed the authentication folders for a pair of 19th-century landscape paintings and hurried downstairs to the kitchen. She frantically dialed the number for Julian Vance, a high-end private appraiser who catered exclusively to the suburban elite. Julian arrived less than an hour later, stepping out of a sleek black sedan. He wore a tailored suit and carried a specialized leather appraisal kit. Sloane met him at the door, forcing a tight, socially acceptable smile that felt like cracked glass on her face. Julian set up his equipment on the granite kitchen island. He placed a jeweler's loupe over his eye and meticulously examined the watches under a bright portable halogen light. The silence in the kitchen stretched out agonizingly as Sloane watched him work. Her palms sweated. She mentally planned her immediate escape. A first-class ticket to Europe, a luxury hotel, anywhere away from the foul smell of sickness and the aggressive legal threats closing in around her. "These are absolutely exquisite," Julian finally murmured, removing the loupe and carefully placing the vintage Patek back into its velvet slot. "The market for the Daytona is exceptionally strong right now. Combined with the verified provenance of the two oil paintings in the foyer, you are looking at a highly conservative estimate of $350,000. I have private buyers who could authorize a wire transfer within 4 hours." A massive wave of pure, euphoric relief crashed over Sloane. She let out a breath she felt she had been holding for days. $350,000. It was a lifeline. It was total salvation. "Do it," she said quickly, her voice sharp with desperation. "Initiate the transfer right now, Julian. I need the funds immediately." Julian nodded professionally and opened his slim tablet to finalize the brokerage paperwork. As a licensed appraiser dealing with high-value estate assets, he was legally required to run a standard title and lien check through the state property registry. He tapped the screen rapidly, his eyes scanning the digital database. Suddenly, Julian's fingers stopped moving. The polite, accommodating smile completely vanished from his face. He blinked, staring hard at the high-resolution screen. He scrolled down, tapped a secondary link, and read the generated text. The atmosphere in the kitchen instantly shifted, turning suffocatingly cold. "Is there a problem?" Sloane demanded, her anxiety spiking instantly. Julian slowly pushed the tablet across the granite island, turning the screen directly toward her. "I cannot broker this sale, Sloane," he stated, his voice dropping an entire octave into a tone of absolute professional detachment. "In fact, I have to leave your property immediately, and I highly advise you to return those items exactly where you found them." Sloane stared at the tablet. Bold red text glared back at her from the official state registry portal. It was a comprehensive judicial injunction, a blanket asset freeze. Marcus Thorne had not just placed a lien on the house itself. Claire's ruthless legal team had filed an emergency injunction locking down every single physical asset associated with Richard's estate. The watches, the paintings, the antique furniture, the silver. Everything was legally frozen to act as collateral for the $1.68 million caregiver debt. Claire had perfectly anticipated the theft. She knew exactly what Sloane would try to do the absolute second she ran out of options. "You cannot sell a single item from this estate," Julian explained, packing his equipment with rapid, frantic movements. "If you remove these assets, you will be committing felony grand larceny and attempting to defraud a primary creditor. Apex Healthcare Concierge holds priority status on all assets within these walls. I will not be an accessory to asset hiding." "Please," Julian, Sloane begged, grabbing his tailored sleeve. "Just take the watches, pay me in cash. Nobody has to know." Julian violently yanked his arm away, looking at her with absolute, unfiltered disgust. "Are you insane?" he snapped, snapping his briefcase shut. "I am not risking my broker's license and facing federal fraud charges for you. You are completely bankrupt, Sloane. Your family is legally toxic. Do not ever contact my office again." Julian practically ran to the front door, leaving Sloane standing completely alone in the kitchen with the worthless velvet box. The $350,000 lifeline evaporated into nothing. "Sloane. Sloane. Get in here right now!" Richard screamed from the master bedroom, his voice a harsh, grating command. Sloane slowly walked down the hallway, dragging her feet like a condemned prisoner. She stepped into the bedroom. Richard was glaring at her, his face red with exertion and unhinged rage. "I have been calling you for 10 minutes, he bellowed, pointing a shaking, frail finger at her. "I need my specialty physical therapy exercises done immediately. My joints are locking up. Claire always did the stretching routine at exactly this time. You are completely useless. You stand around doing nothing while I suffer. You are a pathetic excuse for a daughter." Sloane stared at the angry, demanding man in the bed. He required specialized physical therapy, precise medication, management, customized dietary preparation, and round-the-clock vital monitoring. He demanded 5-star medical service from a woman who had never worked a hard day in her life. Sloane completely broke down. She dropped to her knees at the foot of the bed, sobbing uncontrollably. She lacked the basic competence, the physical strength, and the sheer discipline to do even 10% of what Claire had effortlessly executed for 7 long years. She was drowning. She looked up at Richard through her blurry tears. The bank was foreclosing. Claire was seizing the assets. Jamal had stolen everything else. There was no money for private nurses. There was no money for premium home care. There was absolutely no money left at all. She pulled her phone from her pocket. She opened the web browser and typed in a search query she thought she would never have to use in her entire life. She bypassed the luxury private assisted living facilities with their massive deposits and exorbitant monthly fees. She scrolled directly to the bottom of the list. She searched for state-funded Medicaid nursing homes. The facilities that popped up on her screen were bleak, harsh fluorescent lighting, shared rooms with thin privacy curtains, institutional linoleum floors, and severely overworked staff. These were the exact type of poor people facilities Richard had spent his entire elite life relentlessly mocking. He had often joked over expensive dinners that state care was a warehouse for failures and a waiting room for the destitute. Sloane stared at the screen, her finger hovering over the bold blue phone number for the State Department of Health and Human Services. It was the ultimate devastating irony. Richard's boundless arrogance and relentless cruelty had stripped away every single premium option he possessed. He had alienated the only person capable of providing him with luxury care. Sloane wiped a tear from her cheek, her expression hardening into cold, desperate survival mode. She tapped the phone number, initiating the call to the state intake coordinator. Richard was going to the exact place he had always despised. Sloane slammed the laptop shut with a violent crack that echoed through the empty kitchen. The glowing screen displaying state-funded Medicaid facilities disappeared, but the suffocating reality of her situation remained. She was completely bankrupt, legally cornered, and entirely alone. Down the grand hallway, Richard's voice rose into another furious, grating demand for his dinner and a sponge bath. The incessant yelling felt like a physical drill boring directly into her skull. She could not do this. She absolutely refused to do this. She marched into the massive walk-in pantry and grabbed the cheapest, driest box of generic saltine crackers she could find. She snatched a lukewarm bottle of tap water from the counter and stormed toward the master bedroom. The stench of untreated illness and poor ventilation hit her instantly as she crossed the threshold. Richard was propped up awkwardly against the decorative pillows, his face flushed with exertion and rage. "Where is my customized meal tray?" he barked, glaring at her empty hands. "Claire always had my grilled salmon and steamed vegetables precisely at 6 o'clock. You are intentionally trying to starve me." Sloane stepped up to the edge of the mattress and threw the heavy cardboard box of crackers directly onto his chest. "Eat." Sloane snapped, her voice devoid of any familial warmth or sympathy. "I am leaving. I am going to track down Jamal and get my money back." Richard's face contorted with apoplectic rage. The box of crackers slid off his chest and hit the floor, spilling dry saltines across the expensive rug. "You are walking out on me," he screamed, a terrifying wheeze rattling in his lungs. "You are a worthless, pathetic coward. You run away. The absolute second life demands anything from you. You did the exact same thing when you dropped out of your graduate program after 2 weeks because the reading list was too long. You cried like a child until I wired you $50,000 so you could run away to Paris and recover from the stress. You run from everything. You are fundamentally weak." Sloane did not argue. She did not defend herself. She turned her back on the screaming man, walked out into the hallway, and pulled the heavy, solid oak door shut. With a cold, terrifying finality, she twisted the exterior deadbolt lock. The metallic click sealed him inside. She grabbed a packed weekend bag, walked out the front door, and ordered a cheap rideshare to the bus terminal, completely abandoning him. Inside the stifling, locked bedroom, the shadows slowly lengthened into darkness. For hours, Richard's immense pride refused to let him acknowledge his situation. He yelled until his throat bled, demanding to be released, demanding his nurses, demanding his power back. Silence answered him. Eventually, basic human biology forced the issue. His bladder was full. He was Richard Wilson, a titan of industry. He absolutely refused to soil his own bed. He gripped the edge of the standard mattress, attempting to swing his legs over the side to stand. But without the motorized guardrails, the perfectly calibrated incline, or the hydraulic lift mechanisms Claire had expertly maintained, he misjudged his own momentum. His weakened core completely failed him. He pitched forward, slipping off the edge of the bed and tumbling downward. He struck the hardwood floor with a sickening, heavy thud. A sharp, blinding pain shot up through his hip and radiated down his spine. He gasped, trying to push himself up his arms, shaking violently under his own weight, but his atrophied muscles completely gave out. He collapsed flat onto the cold wood, staring helplessly at the dust collecting under the dresser. He was entirely immobilized, but the house was not deaf. Tucked discreetly into the upper crown molding of the room was a sleek, matte black sensor no larger than a smoke detector. When Claire had retrofitted the estate years ago to accommodate his declining health, she had installed a military-grade ambient biometric monitoring system. Richard had mercilessly ridiculed it. He had demanded she remove the intrusive cameras, claiming he refused to be treated like a lab rat for her useless tech startup. Claire had calmly explained they were not cameras, they were thermal and kinetic tracking modules. He had mocked her anyway, calling it a pathetic waste of money. Now that exact system registered the sudden violent drop in altitude. It tracked the prolonged lack of vertical movement. It continuously measured the subtle drop in Richard's ambient body temperature as he lay stranded on the floor. After a programmed interval of zero responsiveness, the system's algorithm bypassed the house Wi-Fi connected directly to a cellular backup network and triggered an uncancelable Level 1 medical emergency dispatch straight to county first responders. The piercing shriek of heavy sirens shattered the quiet suburban morning. Two massive paramedic trucks and three armed police cruisers tore up the long driveway, their lights flashing against the pristine brick exterior. Finding the front door locked, the officers immediately breached it with a tactical battering ram. They swept the house rapidly, their heavy boots pounding against the hardwood floors. When they reached the master bedroom and discovered the exterior deadbolt engaged, an officer kicked the door inward, splintering the heavy wooden frame into pieces. The smell hit the rescue team instantly, a foul, highly concentrated combination of urine, sweat, and profound neglect. They found Richard trembling on the floor, severely dehydrated, his lips cracked and bleeding, clutching a crushed plastic water bottle he could not open. Late Sunday evening, Sloane stepped out of a rideshare at the end of the driveway. Her weekend trip had been a spectacular failure. Jamal had completely vanished, covering his digital and financial tracks like a professional ghost. She was exhausted, humiliated, and entirely broke. As she dragged her bag up the driveway, she froze. The property was bathed in the harsh, rotating red and blue lights of two remaining police cruisers. Yellow crime scene tape was stretched across the splintered front door. A stern-faced detective stepped off the porch, shining a high-beam flashlight directly into her eyes. "Sloane Wilson," he demanded, his voice cutting through the crisp night air. "Yes," she stammered, raising her hands to block the blinding light, panic seizing her chest. "What is going on here? Where is my father?" Two uniformed officers stepped out from the shadows bordering the garden. They grabbed her arms with zero hesitation. They forcefully spun her around, slamming her chest against the hood of the nearest cruiser. The cold, heavy steel of handcuffs bit viciously into her wrists, clicking shut with a sharp sound that signaled the absolute end of her privileged life. "Sloane Wilson, you are under arrest for the severe neglect, endangerment, and unlawful imprisonment of a vulnerable adult," the detective stated coldly, reciting her Miranda rights as the watching neighbors peeked through their curtains to see the golden child of the neighborhood shoved into the back of a police car. The heavy oak doors of the county family court swung shut with a resounding thud that echoed through the sterile, windowless room. Sloane sat at the chipped laminate defense table, staring blankly at the deeply scratched wood. She wore the exact same silk blouse she had packed in her desperate weekend getaway bag, but it was now hopelessly wrinkled and stained with nervous sweat. Her perfectly maintained blonde hair showed harsh, dark roots, a glaring physical manifestation of her completely frozen bank accounts. Beside her sat David Miller, a perpetually exhausted public defender carrying a battered cardboard folder. Because Claire's aggressive legal injunction had locked down every single asset tied to the Wilson estate, and Jamal had drained her personal accounts, Sloane could not afford to retain private counsel. She was entirely destitute, relying on the exact same underfunded legal aid system her father had spent his entire life mocking. The side doors near the judge's bench clicked open, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. Two state-employed nurses wearing practical faded scrubs wheeled Richard into the courtroom. The sight of him was absolutely staggering. The imposing titan of corporate industry was completely gone. Richard sat slumped in a standard-issue medical wheelchair, wearing a thin gray hospital gown and non-slip socks. His skin was pale and papery, his eyes vacant and deeply sunken. The state-funded Medicaid facility had stripped away his remaining arrogance, leaving behind a fragile, terrified old man. He did not bark orders. He did not demand better accommodations. He simply stared at his lap, a silent ward of the state. Sloane watched him enter, feeling a sharp spike of nausea. She turned her head, frantically scanning the gallery behind her. Claire sat in the second row, perfectly composed and utterly untouchable. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer, her posture immaculate, her expression entirely unreadable. Beside her sat Marcus Thorne, her lead corporate attorney, resting his hand on a massive leather briefcase. Claire did not smirk or gloat as she met Sloane's panicked gaze. She simply watched the proceedings with the cold, detached interest of a CEO observing a routine corporate liquidation. Judge Harrison, a stern man with zero tolerance for theatrics, took his seat at the high bench and adjusted his reading glasses. We are here today to address the emergency state guardianship of Richard Wilson and the corresponding asset receivership motions filed by Apex Healthcare Concierge. He announced, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. We will also address the preliminary findings regarding the felony neglect charges currently pending against Sloan Wilson. David Miller stood up, adjusting his cheap tie. Your Honor, my client was operating under extreme duress. She was abandoned by her spouse and left without access to essential financial resources to procure adequate private care. We request leniency regarding the permanent guardianship transfer. Sloan could not handle the passive defensive stance. Her deeply ingrained entitlement, her absolute refusal to accept accountability violently took over. She shoved her chair back, its metal legs screeching loudly against the linoleum floor. She ignored her public defender's frantic whisper to sit down. This is a massive setup, Your Honor. Sloan cried out, forcing wet, dramatic tears to spill down her cheeks. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at the gallery. My sister orchestrated this entire nightmare. She is a ruthless, calculating monster. Judge Harrison frowned deeply, staring at Sloan over the rim of his glasses. Miss Wilson, I strongly advise you to let your appointed counsel speak on your behalf. No, you have to listen to me, Sloan shouted, her voice echoing shrilly off the wood-paneled walls. She played the role of the desperate victim to absolute perfection, throwing her hands up in the air. Claire intentionally sabotaged me. She installed hidden military-grade spy cameras in my father's bedroom to trap me. She used her corporate lawyers to freeze my bank accounts, so I could not even buy groceries or hire replacement nurses. She deliberately engineered a situation where I would fail. She drove my husband away. She abandoned our father just so she could swoop in, play the hero, and steal our entire family estate. She is the real abuser here. She should be the one in handcuffs. Sloan stood panting, chest heaving, waiting for the judge to see the absolute truth of her victimhood. She waited for the gallery to turn and glare at Claire. She waited for the ultimate validation she had received her entire life whenever she threw a tantrum and blamed someone else for her catastrophic failures. Instead, the sharp, explosive crack of the judge's wooden gavel echoed like a gunshot through the courtroom. That is enough. Judge Harrison bellowed, his voice carrying absolute, unquestionable authority. Sit down and be silent immediately, Miss Wilson, or I will hold you in direct contempt of this court and have the bailiff remove you from this room. Sloan froze, her mouth hanging slightly open. The shock of being spoken to with such intense, unfiltered reprimand forced her slowly back into her plastic chair. David Miller rubbed his temples, clearly exasperated by his client's total lack of self-preservation. Judge Harrison shook his head in absolute disgust. He reached across his expansive wooden bench and pulled forward a massive stack of bound documents. The thick binder was stamped with the sleek silver logo of Apex Healthcare Concierge. You stand in my courtroom facing charges of severe endangerment to a vulnerable adult, and you have the sheer audacity to claim you are the victim of a corporate conspiracy. Judge Harrison stated, his tone laced with heavy incredulity. You claim you were set up to fail. Let us look at the actual verified reality of your situation, Miss Wilson. He opened the heavy binder, the crisp pages rustling loudly in the silent room. I have right here a mountain of irrefutable biometric data submitted by Apex Healthcare Concierge. The judge continued, tapping the paper firmly. This data does not contain hidden cameras as you falsely claim. It contains kinetic fall sensors and thermal mapping technology. This technology clearly shows your father lying stranded on a hardwood floor for 14 consecutive hours while his core body temperature plummeted into severe hypothermia. Sloan swallowed hard, her throat entirely dry. Furthermore, Judge Harrison turned the page, reading the next set of documents. I have certified financial audits and private appraisal logs. They explicitly detail your attempt to illegally fence over $300,000 worth of estate assets, rather than calling a single medical professional or emergency service to assist your father. You did not lack resources, Miss Wilson. You lacked basic human decency. You locked a severely ill man inside a room with a box of dry crackers and fled the state. The judge closed the heavy binder with a definitive thud that signaled the absolute destruction of Sloane's defense. He turned his attention directly to Claire's legal team preparing to permanently strip away everything the Wilson family had ever owned. Judge Harrison adjusted his reading glasses and looked down at the massive binder resting on his elevated bench. The courtroom remained completely silent. Marcus Thorne stood up from the plaintiff's table. He buttoned his tailored suit jacket and stepped toward the center of the room. He did not look at Sloane. He did not look at Richard. He addressed the judge with the cold precision of a surgeon about to make the first incision. "Your Honor." Marcus began, his voice projecting effortlessly. "The defense claims a conspiracy. They claim my client, Claire Wilson, deliberately trapped them in a financial web. The reality is far less theatrical and far more damning. The documents before you represent 7 years of premium uninterrupted medical care provided by Apex Healthcare Concierge." Marcus walked over to a presentation monitor and tapped a small remote. A highly detailed spreadsheet appeared on the screen. "For 84 months, my client's company provided Richard Wilson with round-the-clock private nursing, customized respiratory therapies, specialized hydraulic beds, and daily pharmaceutical coordination," Marcus stated, pointing to the scrolling numbers. "Richard Wilson demanded nothing but the absolute best. He received 5-star medical concierge service. The total accumulated cost for these services, properly invoiced and legally deferred against the primary estate, comes to exactly $1,680,000. This caregiver's lien was filed legally, transparently, and with the full consent of the patient." Sloane scoffed loudly from her plastic chair. "Consent," she shrieked, ignoring her public defender's frantic gesture to stay quiet. "He is a sick old man. Claire manipulated him into signing his life away. She knew exactly what she was doing." Marcus turned his gaze toward Sloane. He did not raise his voice. He simply pressed another button on his remote. The spreadsheet vanished, replaced by a high-definition timeline featuring time-stamped photographs and digital receipts. "Let us discuss manipulation and care," Miss Wilson, Marcus said smoothly. "Because the court record needs to be absolutely clear on who abandoned whom." Marcus walked the judge through the exact sequence of events following Claire's lawful removal of her company's equipment. He showed the digital log from the biometric sensors in the master bedroom, proving Richard was left entirely unmonitored. He displayed the call logs from Sloane's cell phone, proving she never contacted a single medical professional, a private nurse, or even a basic telehealth hotline. Instead of securing emergency care for a highly vulnerable adult, Marcus continued, his tone turning sharp. Sloane Wilson contacted a private estate appraiser named Julian Vance. She attempted to illegally liquidate $350,000 worth of frozen estate assets to fund her own escape. When Mr. Vance informed her of the legal injunction, she did not stay to care for her father. Marcus clicked the remote again. A photo of Sloane hauling a designer weekender bag into a rideshare appeared on the screen, followed by a digital receipt from a luxury hotel 2 states away. She locked the master bedroom door from the outside, threw a box of dry crackers onto his chest, and left him to die, so she could clear her head for the weekend, Marcus stated, letting the brutal reality of the words hang in the heavy courtroom air. If my client had not installed the ambient fall sensors that Miss Wilson and her father repeatedly mocked as useless tech, Richard Wilson would have expired on his hardwood floor. Claire Wilson's company saved his life. Sloane Wilson left him for dead. Sloane shrank back into her chair, her face draining of all color. The public defender beside her rubbed his eyes completely out of ammunition. The state nurses standing behind Richard's wheelchair shifted uncomfortably, staring at Sloane with open disgust. Richard, however, could not accept the public dismantling of his ego. The idea that he was a helpless victim saved by the daughter he despised while being abandoned by the daughter he worshipped shattered his fragile mind. He gripped the thin armrests of his medical wheelchair, his knuckles turning white. He leaned forward, his chest heaving as he forced air into his damaged lungs. "It is a lie," Richard rasped, his voice echoing weakly across the room. He pointed a shaking, liver-spotted hand at Claire, who sat perfectly still in the gallery. She tricked me. She is a corporate shark. She slipped those contracts into my routine medical files. I thought I was signing basic insurance waivers. She defrauded her own father. I never agreed to liquidate my estate. I demanded investigation into her company. She stole my house. Marcus Thorne did not flinch. He did not argue. He calmly walked back to the plaintiff's table, opened a secondary leather folder, and pulled out a single sheet of printed paper. He walked it directly up to the judge's bench. "Your Honor," Marcus said, handing over the document. The plaintiff submits Exhibit D. This is a verified email sent directly from Richard Wilson's personal account to Claire Wilson's corporate inbox. It is dated 5 years ago, precisely 2 weeks before the primary caregiver's lien was authorized. Marcus turned to face Richard. The courtroom held its collective breath. At the time Marcus explained, his voice echoing with absolute authority, my client repeatedly requested that her father review the financial terms of his ongoing care. She scheduled meetings, she sent portfolios. Richard Wilson refused all of them. Instead, he sent this email. Marcus looked down at his own copy of the document and read it aloud, ensuring every single syllable resonated through the room. "Claire, whatever paperwork your little nurse company needs me to sign to keep the free equipment coming, just leave it on the counter. I don't have time to read your administrative garbage. Just highlight the signature line so I can get back to my actual business." The silence that followed was absolute. The brutal, arrogant dismissal in the email perfectly captured the dynamic of the Wilson family. Richard had viewed Claire's multi-million-dollar enterprise as a petty, insignificant hobby. He had viewed her world-class medical care as an entitlement, something he deserved for free, simply by virtue of existing. He had been so entirely blinded by his own narcissism that he handed her the keys to his empire without bothering to read a single line of text. Richard sat frozen in his wheelchair. His jaw worked silently, but no words came out. The fiery rage in his eyes flickered and died, replaced by the crushing, terrifying realization of his own hubris. He had dug his own grave, bought the headstone, and demanded Claire carve the lettering. Judge Harrison slowly lowered the piece of paper. He took off his reading glasses and stared down at the frail man in the wheelchair. The judge's expression held no pity, no judicial neutrality, only profound and utter disgust. "You were not tricked, Mr. Wilson," Judge Harrison stated, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "You signed away your estate because of your own arrogance, sir." The echoing silence in the courtroom was absolute following the judge's devastating rebuke. Richard slumped back in his basic medical wheelchair, his chest heaving as he struggled to process the sheer magnitude of his own catastrophic blunder. For his entire adult life, he had wielded his wealth like a blunt weapon, intimidating anyone who dared to question his authority. Now his signature on a document he considered too insignificant to read had systematically dismantled his empire. Judge Harrison did not offer a single ounce of sympathy. He straightened his black robe and adjusted his microphone, his eyes scanning the finalized legal decrees resting on his bench. "This court recognizes the overwhelming validity of the financial documentation submitted by Apex Healthcare Concierge," the judge began, his voice ringing with cold procedural finality. "The caregiver lien placed upon the Wilson estate is fundamentally lawful and entirely enforceable. Mr. Wilson, you willingly entered into a premium medical service contract. You received exactly what you demanded, and now the bill has come due." The judge picked up his pen and signed the top document with a heavy, deliberate stroke. "Therefore, I am ordering the immediate and total transfer of the primary residential property to the plaintiff. The house, valued at $1.2 million, is hereby signed over to the corporate holdings of Apex Healthcare Concierge to satisfy the bulk of the outstanding medical debt. Furthermore, the secondary assets, including the antique watch collection and the original artwork, are ordered liquidated to cover the remaining balance of $480,000. As of this exact moment, the Wilson estate is valued at $0. You are entirely bankrupt." Richard let out a strangled, pathetic gasp. He reached out with a trembling, frail hand toward the bench. "You cannot do this," he rasped, his voice breaking into a dry cough. "I am Richard Wilson. I built that company. I built that house. I demand a private room. I demand my standard of living. You are in no position to demand anything from anyone ever again, Judge Harrison snapped, silencing him instantly. You are legally destitute. The judge then turned his piercing gaze toward the defense table where Sloane sat, frozen in her wrinkled silk blouse. She looked like a cornered animal, her eyes darting frantically toward the exit doors. Sloane Wilson. Judge Harrison stated, his tone dropping into a low, dangerous register. Your actions in this matter represent the most vile, self-serving display of familial neglect I have seen in my entire career on the bench. You abandoned a highly vulnerable adult. You locked him inside a room, restricted his access to hydration, and fled the jurisdiction in a pathetic attempt to hide stolen assets. You are stripped of your power of attorney immediately. Sloane opened her mouth to argue, but the public defender violently grabbed her forearm, forcing her to remain seated. Because you have no prior criminal record, the state has agreed to a strict plea arrangement regarding the felony neglect charges. The judge continued, his eyes burning into her. You are sentenced to 5 years of supervised felony probation. In addition, you are ordered to complete 1,000 hours of mandatory community service. You will be assigned to empty bedpans, mop floors, and assist the janitorial staff at the exact same underfunded county medical facilities you tried to escape. If you miss a single shift, if you violate one single term of this probation, I will personally revoke your plea deal and sentence you to maximum time in a state penitentiary. Do you understand me? Yes, Sloane whispered, the last remaining shred of her unearned entitlement evaporating into thin air. She was completely trapped. She would spend the next 5 years doing grueling, humiliating manual labor for free, monitored by a probation officer who would not care about her ruined credit score or her lost social status. Judge Harrison stacked his papers and looked down at Richard one final time. With your assets entirely depleted and your primary caregiver facing felony probation, you are legally designated as a ward of the state. You require round-the-clock medical supervision that you can no longer afford. Therefore, I am signing the order committing you to the county Medicaid nursing facility. 2 burly state orderlies stepped forward from the back of the courtroom. They wore generic green polo shirts and heavy rubber-soled shoes. They walked directly up behind Richard's wheelchair and gripped the handles. Please, Richard begged, looking frantically toward the gallery. He locked eyes with Claire. She sat perfectly still in her tailored charcoal suit, surrounded by her victorious legal team. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She simply watched him with the exact same clinical detachment he had shown her for her entire life. She was a CEO observing the successful conclusion of a hostile corporate takeover. Claire, please. Richard pleaded, a single tear cutting a track through the dry skin of his cheek. I am your father. Bring me home. Give me my nurses back. Claire stood up, buttoned her blazer, and picked up her leather portfolio. You do not have a home, Richard, she said quietly, her voice echoing slightly in the vast room. You have a state-assigned bed. Goodbye. She turned and walked out of the courtroom, her heels clicking rhythmically against the floor, never looking back. The judge banged his gavel heavily against the sounding block. This court is adjourned. The state orderlies immediately spun Richard's wheelchair around and pushed him toward the harsh fluorescent lights of the exit hallway. Richard gripped the cheap plastic armrests of the chair as the rubber wheels rattled aggressively over the metal threshold of the door. He was being wheeled out to a standard rusted transport van waiting in the loading dock. There would be no customized dietary preparation. There would be no luxury orthopedic mattress. He was heading to a crowded linoleum-floored room divided by a thin privacy curtain where overworked staff would treat him as just another anonymous file number. As the heavy courtroom doors swung shut behind him, the terrifying reality finally crushed whatever was left of his pride. His life of elite luxury, boundless privilege, and unchecked cruelty was permanently over. The state orderlies pushed Richard through the heavy double doors and out into the harsh, buzzing fluorescent light of the courthouse hallway. The wheels of his standard-issue medical chair squeaked loudly against the scuffed linoleum floor. The air out here smelled of industrial bleach and stale coffee, a sterile, distinctly institutional scent that made Richard's stomach churn. He had spent his entire existence insulated from spaces like this. He was a man accustomed to private mahogany boardrooms, executive suites, and velvet-lined luxury. Now he was just another anonymous case file being processed through the county system. The orderlies paused near the elevator bank to adjust the flimsy metal footrests of his chair, completely ignoring his presence as they casually discussed their lunch plans. Richard stared at the scuffed tips of their rubber-soled shoes, a visceral wave of panic rising in his throat. He was actually going to a state-funded warehouse for the destitute. It was no longer a threat. It was his immediate reality. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom clicked open again. Claire emerged into the hallway flanked by Marcus Thorne and two junior associates. She looked immaculate. Her posture was perfectly straight, her expression holding the calm, focused energy of a chief executive who had just successfully closed a highly profitable corporate acquisition. She adjusted the cuff of her tailored charcoal blazer and began walking toward the main exit. Richard saw her approaching. His heart hammered violently against his ribs. The crushing weight of his pride, the monumental arrogance that had defined his entire personality for decades, finally shattered completely. He had absolutely nothing left to leverage. He had no power, no money, and no authority. He possessed only sheer, unadulterated terror. As Claire walked past, Richard threw his upper body forward against the restrictive canvas straps of his wheelchair. He reached out with a trembling, frail arm. His liver-spotted fingers curled desperately around the pristine wool fabric of her sleeve. "Claire, please!" Richard begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic, wet sob. Real, unrestrained tears spilled over his lower lids and tracked deeply through the wrinkles of his sunken face. "You have the money. Pay for a private facility. Don't leave me with those people." He stared up at her, his eyes wide and silently pleading. He was begging not just for his life, but for his status. Even in his absolute ruin, his primary fear was being grouped with the impoverished masses he had spent a lifetime systematically exploiting and mocking. He silently prayed that some residual shred of daughterly affection remained buried beneath her cold exterior. He prayed she would save him from the ultimate humiliation of Medicaid living. Claire stopped. She did not flinch. She did not yank her arm away in disgust, nor did she raise her voice. She simply looked down at the frail, weeping man gripping her coat. Her eyes held an expression of profound, absolute emptiness. It was the exact same clinical, unfeeling gaze Richard had leveled at his own employees right before terminating their pensions to boost his quarterly profit margins. Claire reached down with her free hand. She gently but firmly peeled his shaking fingers off her sleeve, removing his hand with deliberate precision. She smoothed the slightly wrinkled fabric of her coat. "You told me at Christmas that failures don't belong in your house, Dad," Claire said, her voice dropping into a tone of absolute chilling indifference. "You failed to plan. You failed to be a father. I'm just letting you experience the consequences." Richard gasped as if all the oxygen had been violently sucked from the hallway. He stared at the woman standing above him, finally realizing the horrifying truth. She was not acting out of hot, passionate vengeance. She was not trying to teach him a lesson or force an apology. She was executing a cold, calculated liquidation of a toxic asset. She felt absolutely nothing for him. Claire turned on her heel and walked away. The rhythmic, sharp clicking of her designer heels echoed down the long corridor, growing fainter until she pushed through the front glass doors and stepped out into the bright afternoon sun. She climbed into the back of a waiting black luxury sedan and disappeared forever. "All right, Pop. Time to go," one of the orderlies muttered, gripping the handles of the wheelchair and pushing Richard toward the freight elevator. They rolled him out the back service exit into the gray, overcast afternoon. A rusted white transport van idled near the loading dock, its exhaust billowing into the damp air. The orderly pressed a button, and a mechanical hydraulic lift slammed down onto the concrete with a harsh metallic screech. They rolled Richard onto the metal platform and hoisted him upward like a piece of broken freight. The heavy rear doors slammed shut with a definitive booming thud, sealing Richard Wilson in the dark, plunging him permanently into the exact nightmare he had created. Sloane stood paralyzed just outside the courtroom doors, her back pressed hard against the cold plaster wall. She had watched the entire exchange between her father and sister, unable to move, unable to breathe. Her father's agonizing sobs still rang in her ears, but she could not afford to mourn him. She was entirely consumed by the crushing weight of her own judicial sentence. 5 years of felony probation. 1,000 hours of mandatory community service. The reality of scrubbing biohazard waste, emptying bedpans, and mopping sticky linoleum floors while wearing a neon county-issued vest made her physically nauseous. If she missed a single shift, she would be sent directly to a maximum security state penitentiary. She had no car, no home, and zero access to cash. She was going to have to ride the public bus to her assigned manual labor shifts. Suddenly, a harsh, buzzing vibration startled her. The cheap, prepaid plastic smartphone her public defender had handed her earlier buzzed aggressively in the pocket of her stained slacks. She despised the device. It felt dirty and humiliating in her hands, a stark downgrade from the seized luxury phone she was used to carrying. She pulled the cracked plastic phone from her pocket. The screen flashed brightly, indicating an urgent push notification from the secure federal banking application she had frantically set up the night before. Sloane swiped the screen with a trembling thumb. A bold red fraud alert dominated the display. Sloane's eyes scanned the automated text, her heart stopping completely in her chest. Jamal had not just drained her checking accounts. The federal investigation log indicated he had officially fled the country. He had successfully bypassed the international firewalls, boarded a flight using a secondary passport, and landed in a nation with 0 active extradition treaties. Jamal was gone. He was a ghost. But he had not left empty-handed. Sloane scrolled further down the screen, her breathing turning shallow and rapid. Jamal had utilized her personal information, her social security number, and her previously pristine credit score to open a massive web of high-interest predatory credit lines and shadow loans. He had forged her electronic signature across over a dozen unsecured business accounts right before vanishing into thin air. The final staggering balance glared back at her in bright red digital ink. Jamal had left her holding exactly $150,000 in fraudulent, unpayable debt. The cheap phone slipped from Sloane's sweating fingers and clattered onto the linoleum floor. She was a convicted felon facing half a decade of forced manual labor strictly monitored by the state, with no income, no assets, and a mountain of compounding debt she could never hope to escape. The trap had slammed completely shut. Exactly 1 year later, the heavy, oppressive atmosphere that had once choked the Wilson estate was entirely gone. The towering oak trees that used to cast long, gloomy shadows over the driveway had been meticulously pruned, allowing bright afternoon sunlight to spill across the newly paved walkway. Inside, the physical and emotional transformation was staggering. Claire walked slowly through the grand foyer, her footsteps echoing lightly against the polished white oak floors. Her company, Apex Real Estate Holdings, a newly formed subsidiary of her expanding healthcare empire, had spent the last 8 months completely gutting the property. They had ruthlessly ripped out the dark, suffocating mahogany paneling that Richard had loved so much. They had torn down the heavy velvet drapes that had perpetually blocked out the world. The suffocating leather furniture, the imposing portraits, and the bitter, stagnant air of superiority had all been hauled away in massive industrial dumpsters. In their place, Claire had designed a space defined by light, air, and possibility. Walls had been knocked down to create an open, flowing floor plan. The kitchen, once a sterile space where Sloane had endlessly complained about the hired help, now featured warm marble countertops, a massive central island, and floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the revitalized blooming gardens. Richard's old study, the dark, cavernous room where he had once summoned Claire to mock her ambitions and belittle her intelligence, was entirely unrecognizable. It had been transformed into a brilliant, sunlit nursery, painted a soft, cheerful yellow, completely stripped of its toxic, oppressive energy. The building was no longer a monument to a narcissist. It was finally a home. Claire stood in the center of the living room, smoothing the fabric of her cream-colored trench coat. She checked her watch. Right on time, the heavy front door clicked open. Her real estate agent, a sharp, energetic woman named Vanessa, walked in, followed closely by a young couple holding a toddler. David and Maya Evans stepped into the foyer, their eyes wide with absolute awe. They were not old money. They did not come from trust funds or inherited wealth. David was a hardworking pediatric surgeon, and Maya was a dedicated public school administrator. They had saved diligently for a decade to afford a home in this neighborhood, and they had fallen instantly in love with the property the moment it hit the open market. "It is even more beautiful than I remembered," Maya said, her voice filled with genuine emotion as she looked around the sun-drenched living room. "Thank you so much for working with us on the closing timeline, Claire. We still cannot believe this is ours." Claire smiled, a real warm smile that reached her eyes. "You have earned it, Maya. This house needed a family like yours. It needed good people to fill it with life." Vanessa opened a sleek leather folder on the kitchen island and laid out the final closing documents. The pen scratched rapidly across the thick paper, formalizing the transfer of property. Claire watched the young couple sign their names, their faces radiating hope and excitement for their future. For Claire, however, the signatures represented something far more profound. With every stroke of the pen, the final lingering ghosts of her past were being legally and permanently evicted. The years of emotional starvation, the constant degrading comparisons, and the brutal financial manipulation she had endured under Richard's tyrannical rule were officially erased. Claire stepped forward and signed her name on the final seller's disclosure. She picked up the heavy brass keyring and placed it gently into David's outstretched hand. "Congratulations," Claire said, her voice steady and resonant. "Welcome home." As she walked out of the front door and down the driveway toward her waiting car, Claire felt a massive, invisible weight lift off her shoulders. The toxic energy of the Wilson family legacy was officially broken. She climbed into the back seat of her town car and opened her secure corporate tablet. A notification immediately popped up on the screen. The escrow account had cleared. A wire transfer of exactly $1,500,000 had just been successfully routed directly into the primary expansion fund for Apex Healthcare Concierge. Richard's ultimate monument to his own ego had literally funded the next massive phase of her medical empire. The drive to downtown Boston took less than 30 minutes. The luxury car pulled up to the curb outside a towering, state-of-the-art glass and steel skyscraper. The silver letters above the main entrance gleamed brilliantly in the sunlight: Apex Healthcare Holdings. Claire stepped out of the vehicle and walked through the sliding glass doors into the bustling, high-ceilinged lobby. The atmosphere inside her company was electric. It was a thriving, high-functioning ecosystem built entirely on competence, respect, and exceptional care. As Claire walked across the polished marble floor toward the private executive elevators, employees actively caught her eye. They did not shrink back in fear the way Richard's employees always had. They offered genuine smiles, nodding with profound professional respect. They knew her story. They knew she had built this massive company from nothing, fighting through unimaginable family sabotage to create an industry-leading standard of care. "Good afternoon, Ms. Wilson," the head of security said warmly, holding the elevator doors open for her. "Good afternoon, Marcus," Claire replied, stepping inside. The elevator shot upward, bypassing the administrative floors and opening directly into the executive penthouse suite. Claire walked past her dedicated team of assistants, exchanging brief, highly efficient updates on the afternoon's schedule. She pushed open the heavy glass doors to her corner office and stepped inside. The room was magnificent, featuring panoramic, uninterrupted views of the entire city skyline. Below her, the busy streets pulsed with life and commerce. She walked over to her massive custom-built desk and set her portfolio down. She took a deep breath, letting the quiet authority of the space settle around her. She was no longer the scapegoat. She was no longer the punching bag for a bitter, aging tyrant. She was no longer the forgotten sister living in the shadows of a golden child who had ultimately destroyed her own life through greed and hubris. Claire stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out over the city she now dominated. She had faced the absolute worst her family had to offer, and she had not just survived it. She had weaponized their arrogance, dismantled their false superiority, and turned their ruin into her own unshakable foundation. She was the undisputed queen of her empire, and her reign had only just begun. Thousands of miles away from Claire's pristine, glass-walled executive suite, Jamal Washington was learning a brutal lesson about the permanence of digital footprints. He had spent the last 12 months living like a king on the stolen funds he had siphoned from Sloane's fraudulently opened accounts. He had traded the cold New England winters for the sun-drenched beaches of Cancun, firmly believing he had executed the perfect escape. He was sipping premium mezcal in an exclusive airport VIP lounge, preparing to board a private charter to a country without an active United States extradition treaty. He felt entirely untouchable. He did not even see the tactical team approach. Two heavily armed federal agents flanked him instantly, snapping cold steel handcuffs over his wrists. The Mexican authorities had coordinated directly with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Jamal's clever financial routing, his shadow loans, and his forged digital signatures had triggered a massive federal wire fraud investigation. The $150,000 he had stolen from Sloane crossed international borders, instantly elevating his crimes to federal felonies. Jamal attempted to deploy his trademark charm, flashing a bright, confident smile and insisting it was all a terrible misunderstanding. The federal agents did not smile back. They dragged him out of the luxury lounge in front of hundreds of staring tourists. Today, Jamal sits in a sweltering concrete holding cell, stripped of his tailored linen suits and expensive watches. He is currently fighting a completely hopeless extradition battle, facing the terrifying reality of spending the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary. His silver tongue is utterly useless against a mountain of digital evidence. Back in Boston, Sloane Wilson was experiencing her own inescapable prison. She stood in front of a sputtering, grease-coated deep fryer, the heavy, nauseating scent of stale oil permanently baked into her polyester uniform. A crackling plastic headset was clamped tightly over her ear, blaring the impatient, muffled demands of yet another drive-through customer. Sloane mechanically punched the brightly colored buttons on the register, her fingers blistered and calloused. She wiped a line of sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist. A customer in a pristine luxury SUV pulled up to her window, glaring at her with open disgust because she had forgotten to include extra ketchup packets. "I am so sorry, ma'am," Sloane mumbled forcefully, swallowing the bitter bile rising in her throat. "Let me get those for you right away." She had to apologize. She had to endure the blatant disrespect from customers who treated her exactly the way she used to treat service workers. She could not afford to lose this minimum wage job. When her grueling 10-hour shift finally ended, Sloane sat on a cracked plastic crate in the alley behind the restaurant and pulled out her phone to check her banking application. It was payday, but the digital numbers glaring back at her offered zero relief. The Internal Revenue Service had already taken its massive mandatory cut. The federal government did not care that Jamal had tricked her. They did not care that she had been manipulated into signing over her Social Security number. They only cared about the unpayable mountain of debt attached to her name. Her wages were heavily, aggressively garnished, leaving her with barely enough money to survive. Sloane rode two crowded public buses back to her apartment. She lived in a single cramped studio on the decaying outskirts of the city. The front door had a broken lock. Black, fuzzy mold crept up the corners of the bathroom ceiling, filling the tiny room with a persistent, damp odor. The radiator clanked violently but produced absolutely no heat. Sloane sat on her lumpy, stained futon and stared at the peeling wallpaper. She had no friends left to call. Her social circle had evaporated the moment her bank accounts froze. She was a convicted felon trapped in a cycle of endless, punishing manual labor, completely isolated and utterly broke. Across the state, Richard Wilson was serving his own unique life sentence. He sat in a vinyl medical chair in the exact center of a brightly lit, chaotic recreation room. The county Medicaid facility was a sensory nightmare. A television mounted to the wall blared an endless, deafening loop of daytime game shows. A woman in a wheelchair 2 feet away repeated the exact same incoherent sentence for hours on end. Medical carts rattled aggressively over the scuffed, dirty linoleum floors. The persistent stinging smell of industrial bleach and soiled linens hung heavy in the air. Richard gripped the cheap plastic armrests of his chair, his knuckles turning a stark bone white with unadulterated rage. He spotted a young, exhausted orderly carrying a tray of pureed institutional food and snapped his fingers imperiously in the air. "Bring me a phone," Richard demanded, his voice raspy and weak, yet still dripping with its old familiar venom. "I demand a telephone immediately. I need to call my broker. I am Richard Wilson. I own a multi-million-dollar manufacturing firm. My daughter is a chief executive officer. I used to be a millionaire. I will have this entire facility shut down by tomorrow morning." The orderly did not flinch. He did not look intimidated, frightened, or even slightly concerned. He simply paused and looked down at Richard with a deeply patronizing, sympathetic smile. "Of course you are, Mr. Wilson," the orderly said in a slow, soothing, entirely dismissive tone, the exact register one might use to placate a confused toddler. "You are a very important man with a very big company. Now it is time to eat your applesauce." The orderly patted Richard gently on the shoulder, set the plastic tray down on his lap, and walked away without looking back. Richard stared after him, his jaw trembling violently. He opened his mouth to scream, to assert his dominance, to force the room to acknowledge his power, but no sound came out. He was completely trapped inside his own failing body. His mind was still sharp enough to fully comprehend the agonizing reality of his downfall, but everyone around him simply wrote off his arrogant, desperate demands as the tragic ravings of advanced dementia. To be a narcissist who is completely ignored, entirely stripped of fear and respect, was a psychological torture worse than death. There would be no redemption arcs, there would be no sudden rescues, no dramatic legal loopholes, and no tearful family reunions. Claire was never coming back to save them. The universe had simply balanced its scales with brutal precision. Jamal, Sloan, and Richard were exactly where their own malicious choices had put them. It was a total, inescapable reality. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the executive boardroom at Apex Healthcare Concierge. High above the bustling streets of Boston, the atmosphere was sharp-focused and entirely insulated from the chaos of the city below. Claire Wilson sat at the head of a massive, polished mahogany conference table. She wore a pristine white suit, her posture commanding and perfectly straight. Across from her sat a 28-year-old woman named Maya Vance. Maya wore a conservative, clearly budget-conscious gray blazer. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, but the white-knuckled grip of her intertwined fingers betrayed her underlying anxiety. Spread out on the digital monitor between them was Maya's professional portfolio. It was by all technical metrics absolutely flawless. She had designed a brilliant, highly efficient routing algorithm for dispatching private medical staff, a system that could save Apex hundreds of thousands of dollars in logistical overhead. However, there was a glaring anomaly on the digital resume. Claire tapped the glass screen with her manicured index finger, her sharp eyes locking onto Maya. "Your technical skills are exceptional," Ms. Vance, Claire stated, her voice projecting a smooth, authoritative calm. "You clearly understand the structural demands of high-level medical administration. However, you have a massive 30-month gap right in the center of your undergraduate education. You dropped out of a premier university, vanished from the workforce for 2.5 years, and then quietly finished your degree at a local community college. I need you to explain this discrepancy." Maya swallowed hard. The color drained slightly from her face. This was the moment she had been dreading, the exact point in every previous interview where corporate recruiters politely closed their folders and dismissed her. But she did not lower her gaze. She looked directly back at Claire, her jaw setting with a quiet, hardened resolve. "I stepped away from my degree program because my family required a full-time unpaid medical caretaker." Maya explained, her voice steady, despite the high stakes of the room. "My grandfather suffered a severe stroke. He required round-the-clock monitoring, specialized feeding routines, and intensive physical therapy. Professional care was expensive, so my parents informed me that as the daughter of the household, stepping in was my natural obligation." Claire stopped tapping the screen. She went completely still. She did not interrupt, allowing the heavy silence of the boardroom to pull the rest of the truth out into the open air. I was told it would only be for a single semester. Maya continued, a bitter edge creeping into her professional tone. But a semester turned into a year, and a year turned into 2. When I finally demanded to return to my studies, my parents informed me that my college fund had been entirely depleted. They had quietly reallocated my tuition money to pay for my older brother's master's degree in business administration. They told me his education was a critical family investment, while my time and labor were simply expected for free. They called me selfish for wanting to leave. Maya took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing herself to maintain her composure. So I packed my bags the next morning. I took a job working the graveyard shift at a logistics warehouse to pay my own rent, and I finished my degree online. I do not have the prestigious university name on my final diploma, Ms. Wilson, but I have the grit, the intelligence, and the absolute drive to make this algorithm work for your company. I just need someone to look past the gap on my resume. The silence that followed was absolute. Claire looked at the young woman sitting across from her. She did not see a desperate, underqualified applicant. She saw a mirror reflection of her own brutal history. She saw the familiar, suffocating dynamic of the golden child and the designated scapegoat. She saw the financial manipulation, the weaponized guilt, and the toxic expectation that a daughter must gladly set herself on fire to keep the rest of the family warm. Maya had lived through the exact same nightmare that Richard and Sloane had forced upon Claire. But more importantly, Claire saw what happened next. Maya had not broken. She had not surrendered to the manipulation. She had walked away completely empty-handed and built her own independent foundation from the ashes of her family's betrayal. Claire reached forward and closed the digital portfolio. The screen went black. Maya's shoulders slumped slightly, anticipating the inevitable rejection. She reached out to gather her printed notes, preparing for the standard hollow corporate dismissal. "You are entirely wrong about one thing," Ms. Vance Claire said, her voice cutting through the quiet room like a diamond blade. Maya froze, looking up in confusion. "You do not need someone to look past that gap on your resume," Claire stated, leaning forward and resting her elbows on the polished wood. "That gap is the most valuable qualification you possess. It proves you understand crisis management. It proves you understand complex medical logistics. And most importantly, it proves you know how to survive when the people who are supposed to protect you decide to throw you to the wolves." Claire opened a fresh, encrypted employment contract on her tablet. She rapidly typed in a series of commands, authorized the document with her biometric signature, and slid the tablet across the table until it rested directly in front of Maya. "I am offering you the position of Senior Director of Logistical Operations effective immediately," Claire announced, her tone ringing with absolute finality. "Your starting salary will be $180,000 a year, plus comprehensive medical benefits and a performance-based equity stake in this company." Maya stared at the digital contract, her eyes widening in absolute shock. The salary was staggering. It was nearly double what she had intended to ask for. She looked up at Claire, her mouth opening and closing in stunned disbelief. Ms. Wilson, Maya stammered, a single tear of profound relief escaping and tracking down her cheek. "I do not know what to say. Why are you doing this? My own parents told me I was a failure. They told me I had a duty to stay." Claire stood up from her leather chair. She walked slowly over to the massive glass window, looking out over the sprawling, vibrant city she now commanded. The sunlight caught the sharp, confident angles of her face. She was no longer a victim. She was the absolute master of her own destiny, and she was building an empire comprised of people exactly like her. Claire turned back to face the young, brilliant woman sitting at her table. "Family isn't blood," Claire said, her voice echoing with undeniable power and hard-won wisdom. "Blood is just biology. Family is mutual respect. Never let anyone tell you that sacrificing your life for their comfort is your duty. Keep your receipts." The cool, crisp evening air of Seattle rolled in from the Puget Sound carrying the faint scent of salt water and pine. Claire Wilson stood near the edge of the expansive glass balcony of her downtown penthouse, her hands resting lightly on the sleek metal railing. The sun was beginning its slow, spectacular descent, igniting the sprawling city skyline in brilliant, fiery shades of crushed violet, burnt orange, and spun gold. The glass towers of the financial district reflected the vibrant colors back into the twilight, creating a dazzling display of light and endless momentum. Behind her, the penthouse was alive with radiant warmth and genuine joy. This was her sanctuary. There was no heavy, suffocating mahogany furniture. There were no oppressive, judgmental portraits staring down from the walls. There were no rigid, unspoken rules about maintaining a flawless facade of generational wealth. Instead, the space was defined by open-air modern elegance and the comforting hum of unforced laughter. Claire turned slightly, looking through the sliding glass doors into her living room. Her chief operating officer was leaning against the kitchen island, laughing warmly at a story being told by her lead software engineer. Maya Vance, now a thriving senior director in the logistics division, was animatedly gesturing with a glass of sparkling water, surrounded by people who listened to her with absolute unwavering respect. These were the people who showed up. They were her chosen family. They were a network built entirely on mutual competence, shared struggles, and unbreakable loyalty. There were no invisible scorecards in this room. There were no golden children and no designated scapegoats. Everyone present had earned their place at the table, and they celebrated each other's victories without a shred of jealousy or hidden agendas. Claire took a slow, deep breath of the evening air. She felt a profound, unshakable sense of grounding. The medical empire she had built was entirely hers. The massive wealth she had accumulated was legally and financially protected. But more importantly, the psychological peace she had cultivated was completely impenetrable. Then a sharp mechanical vibration disrupted the quiet tranquility of the balcony. Claire glanced down at the sleek wrought iron patio table. Her personal smartphone was buzzing aggressively, inching slowly across the smooth glass surface. The screen glowed brightly against the fading twilight. She reached out and picked up the device, her thumb hovering effortlessly over the screen. The caller ID displayed a stark, unmistakable geographic location, followed by the automated tag of a state correctional facility. It was Sloan. Claire stared at the glowing text. She knew exactly what the automated voice on the other end of the line would say if she answered. It would be a desperate collect call request from an inmate. She knew exactly what Sloan would do if she accepted the charges. Sloan would cry. She would beg. She would deploy every single manipulation tactic she had ever learned from their father. She would demand a high-priced defense attorney. She would ask for thousands of dollars to be deposited directly into her commissary account. She would frantically leverage the concept of sisterhood, wielding the very word she had spent 3 decades rendering entirely meaningless. A year ago, seeing that specific number pop up on her screen would have triggered a massive physiological response. Claire's heart rate would have skyrocketed. Her chest would have tightened with a suffocating mixture of anxiety, conditioned guilt, and the overwhelming, crushing pressure of familial obligation. She would have felt the desperate, deeply ingrained urge to fix the problem, to rescue her sister, and to act as the reliable safety net that the Wilson family had so casually and brutally abused for years. But standing on the balcony now, surrounded by the magnificent life she had built from the ashes of their ultimate betrayal, Claire searched herself for a reaction. She waited for the familiar toxic spike of adrenaline. She waited for the phantom weight of guilt to settle on her shoulders. She waited for the anger, the resentment, or even the bitter, vindictive satisfaction of seeing her abuser reduced to begging from a concrete holding cell. She felt absolutely nothing. The realization was stunning in its quiet, brilliant simplicity. There was no anger left to give. There was no lingering desire for revenge. There was no triumphant gloating in knowing that Sloan was currently trapped in a sterile state facility, wearing a highly identifiable uniform and facing the inescapable consequences of her own boundless greed. There was only a vast echoing emptiness where the pain used to reside. The trauma bond was completely, unequivocally severed. Sloan was a stranger. Richard was a stranger. They were simply people who had made catastrophic choices, and they were now paying the ultimate terrifying price for those choices in total isolation. Claire looked at the vibrating phone, the screen illuminating her calm, relaxed features. She did not owe them her anger. She did not owe them her pity. She certainly did not owe them her financial rescue. With a steady, deliberate motion, Claire pressed the red button on the screen. The call was immediately disconnected. The screen went black. She did not stop there. With efficient, practiced movements, she unlocked the device, navigated directly to the blocked contacts list, and permanently added the correctional facility's number. She secured the digital perimeter of her life, ensuring that the toxic remnants of her past could never intrude upon her present reality again. She set the phone face down on the table. The action was entirely unremarkable, requiring no more emotional bandwidth than discarding a piece of useless junk mail. "Claire, is everything all right out here?" a voice called out softly. Claire turned around. Maya was standing near the sliding glass doors, holding 2 crystal wine glasses. The warm, inviting light from the living room spilled out onto the balcony, framing the younger woman in a welcoming glow. "Everything is absolutely perfect," Maya Claire replied, her voice clear, resonant, and entirely unburdened. Claire stepped away from the table, leaving the silenced phone behind in the shadows. She took one of the crystal glasses from Maya and walked back to the very edge of the balcony. The sun had almost entirely vanished below the horizon, leaving behind a brilliant, glowing canvas of twilight. The city below them was beginning to light up, a sprawling, magnificent grid of endless possibility and uninterrupted ambition. Claire raised her glass toward the vibrant Seattle skyline. She took a slow, appreciative sip of the rich, dark wine. A genuine, radiant smile spread across her face.